Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here wearing several hats, but would be talking on behalf of the Global Network for Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction, quite a mouthful. But this network is a network of about 500 plus organizations all over the world. And one of the recent works has been on a community-based risk assessment which we carried out globally in 2009, and I'm going to present you some glimpses of that survey. What was interesting about this whole community-based risk assessment, and coming from this crowdsourcing session and all, I'm a little overwhelmed here. But what it did really was go really beyond the scope of risk assessment per se, not just looking at damage and loss potential, but the idea of generating or spinning off a whole range of dialogues on risk management. And that was really the beauty of this whole exercise, which was carried out in over 48 countries. What we had was the survey itself was called Views from the Frontline, which is available on the website of this network. What it really did was, for the first time, we had a disaster risk reduction based survey at the grassroots, with communities, with local leaders, with people who had no idea about this jargon which we are so familiar with, and we kind of get used to using them on and off. Also, it helped us for the first time develop some kind of crude indicators on on defining resilience and defining household level resilience, something which we've all been struggling with. And I know people who are in this room who have been sharing their thoughts and experiences on how difficult it is to sometimes define and measure risk reduction because of a very intangible kind of implication it has. This survey used the Hyogo framework of action, of which we are all familiar with, as the basis, and therefore it measured the amount of progress the Hyogo framework of action has actually made at the grassroots. We do have the GAR11. We have a session tomorrow which presents really the national picture and the reports which the national governments present. But this was kind of a shadow effort to look at what is happening on the front lines. An interesting aspect of this whole survey was that it allowed cultural interpretations in terms of looking at language barriers and religion, caste, and other ethnicity-related issues, and it sort of transcended over these and allowed some kind of consensus building and aggregation. And perhaps the most rewarding fact was that it was actually administered by complete non-professionals, volunteer, ordinary citizens who are used to working in villages, who are perhaps not even beyond the grade 10 in their education, who actually administered the survey, and the results have been amazing. The effort itself has actually cascaded into a lot of initiatives at local and regional level. Just to give you the idea of how broad the survey was, how wide-ranging, there were 48 countries covered and 400 organizations involved, and these were basically civil society organizations involved in the survey. How did they do this survey? They actually conducted a whole lot of community meetings day after day, held the questionnaire in hand and used various techniques which we are familiar with, participatory appraisals and other mapping techniques which my friend Edmond also mentioned to you briefly about. Used dialoguing as ways of setting up meetings with local government officials and with other influential people at the grassroots, and then try to see how we can develop consensus in terms of giving scores to various indicators. So it was very exhausting but a very exhilarating kind of activities. I realized that this is not the session to talk about what were the results of the survey, but I just wanted to highlight 4 things which people at the front line were saying, and I'm sure we can all relate to that national formulated policies are not generating widespread systemic changes in local practices. That got reinforced through this survey. Resources are scarce when it comes down to local level action and considered as one of the main constraints to progress. But there are resources which remain untapped because they are in a way unrecognized by the usual systems of disaster risk reduction programming. The foundation for building resilience is people's awareness and understanding of the risks that they face, and I'll come to that a little later. And of course, the whole talk about climate change providing us with an opportunity. But just to highlight the finding number 3, the foundation for building resilience is people's awareness. In effect, this is what people said, and it reinforced the need, the importance of where community-based assessments lie, and in terms of how they actually lead to building awareness of people. So it kind of set us in motion and into looking at this as an ongoing cycle of how risk assessments done periodically can actually lead to greater risk reduction ultimately. From a surveyor's point of view, there were a few things which became pretty obvious. One was that, we've spoken about IT technologies and all, but there is still a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots in terms of knowledge on risks. And this is where, one of the problems still remains that needs to be bridged. We've had a whole range of technology options presented to us yesterday and today, but there are still challenges, and we talked about this during the lunch hour about, half the population not having even access to electricity. So where do they run these technology gadgets? It obviously created awareness and risk reduction because in some languages, for example, risk, danger, vulnerability all mean the same thing, And therefore, how do you make some distinctions, and how do you really look at things which can be done in advance to prevent losses in a disaster situation? Interestingly, for the first time, I think the whole debate on risk reduction actually led to looking at local development programming and how it is perpetuating risks or in a way reducing risks either which way, and especially in areas where people have experienced disasters, who have seen what the suffering is really all about. It also brought in a bit of accountability into the whole system by, people talking about their rights, about their need, and how local governments have to ensure that they need to protect the lives of the population which has elected them to power. In many societies, in fact in all societies, I would say there are a lot of innovative risk reduction practices, traditional knowledges, which have not been validated scientifically for some reason or other, and therefore they remain kind of untapped. And this survey for the first time started to bring them out. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of documentation, but it at least set the ball rolling. And I think fairly obvious, it started creating a buzz. I think the risk reduction is still in its infancy in many societies. We've been speaking about them in conferences, but it hasn't really percolated to the grassroots. And therefore, this survey actually started having a cross-sectoral kind of dialogue in which, you started looking at safe schools and hospitals and the need that they should function in event of a disaster. For communities, it also helped them articulate what the risks they face are and how that can be, factored into the local participatory, programming for development. In the region where I come from in India, there were some challenges and lessons learned. I'll point out two which were important and relevant to this discussion here. One is that, of course, we need to understand and recognize that communities are active players in assessing risk. We've seen this in the presentations before about how we can do the cloud sourcing kind of method, and also we also recognize that there are good traditional practices that need to be recognized. There are barriers, of course. A lot of communities and societies still feel that disaster losses are inevitable, and that mindset needs to be turned around, and that requires a lot of education awareness programs. There is, of course, visible discomfort with using quantitative indicators, things which we feel very happy about when we see progress and we find it easy to measure. But when it comes to talking to communities and engaging in this kind of community meetings, we find that as a problem area. So we need to get around this, find more innovative and creative means of actually being able to measure risk at community level. The other part was we found that there is still this barrier for upstream acceptance, which Daniel had been mentioning in his Ignite presentation yesterday as well, about how governments view community-based risk assessments. Either they find them as threats, or there is a kind of suspicion about what are the communities trying to drive them to. So I think it's all hovering around this issue about accountability and keeping your hands off as one way of trying to be in the safe zone and not be accountable to people. So just to conclude, what is the way forward and how do we look at all this process which has been initiated over the last couple of years? One is that, I think we need to reinforce and make this kind of a given in all work that we do, that community-based risk assessments do form the starting point, and therefore they should be as essential part of any work that we do at the grassroots. The second, I think we should, and this conference is saying this very loud and clear, that we need to use and leverage new technologies and methods wherever possible. I think we've made a communication leap in terms of mobile phones, even in developing countries, and then how that can be leveraged to do this kind of surveys, to do this kind of knowledge sharing. The other part, and that is where I started off this discussion, is that how do you make these assessments spiral out into more useful products and processes which can be used in larger programming sense. And one of this is how knowledge can be aggregated based on these assessments, realizing of course the nature of this kind of knowledge, which is crude, which is not validated at times, and can have a lot of noise in the system. Also, the moment you start having these assessments, you help communities to articulate, and therefore that becomes the basis for dialogue. And that's something which we need to develop further, because I think there's less work done in this area. And we should take gratitude from this fact that the most meaningful outcomes should lead to greater accountability towards communities at risk. This is one aspect which is at the center stage of all this discussion. We've seen accountability in many other areas, but somehow we're lagging behind on these rights of public safety, on these issues about how governments need to be responsible for ensuring that their citizens are safe. I'll end here, and I'll ask Maya to focus on her experience in Lebanon on the same survey. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Maya, and I also represent the Global Network for Disaster Reduction, but I also work for World Vision Lebanon on disaster risk management, community-based disaster risk management. So before I start with my presentation, I'd like to tell you why we chose, as Lebanon, to go for views from the front line. First, the very interesting thing was that we had no data whatsoever on disaster risks in Lebanon. Nothing. Not from the government, not from the UN, not from any other organization. So we had a real lack on that front. Second of all, we as World Vision in Lebanon wanted to start doing disaster risk management programs. And we didn't have any assessment or baseline information to start working from. So Views from the Frontline was also a very good start for that. Third, no disaster risk reduction whatsoever had been done by the government, by the Lebanese government, because of other competing priorities and because most of you know that it's a quite politically volatile context and there are more important issues on the government's agenda than disaster risk reduction. Plus, I'd like to share with you that we have a very vibrant civil society in Lebanon. And civil society has usually a lot to say and to do. So we thought it was a great opportunity to activate the civil society into working on disaster risk reduction. And last but not least, I think this has been mentioned, but as World Vision and also as the global network, we think that community-based disaster risk management and community ownership is very important. So we thought that this community-based survey would really bring communities into the whole disaster risk management process. So basically we'll have a very short overview about disasters in Lebanon, community engagement and views from the frontline and perspectives on risk, recommendations by the communities themselves, and current initiatives that resulted from views from the frontline. This is the map of Lebanon, as you can see. Sorry. So basically, before we started with views from the frontline, we tried to dig for secondary data that would at least give us an overview on the at-risk communities in Lebanon, and communities at risk of disasters. Basically, what we came up with was, from a study from the UNDP, the main disasters that happened over the past 30 years, and that also included man-made disasters like conflict. So you can see here we have internal conflict, floods, storms, cross-border war, and wildfires. But that's not all, because, I mean, this is only a 30-year span. In Lebanon, we previously had many earthquakes, and it's still an earthquake-prone area, even though it's not mentioned here. We're having droughts as a result of climate change as well, so we're also not forgetting that, even though it's not mentioned here. So basically, the secondary data we gathered from the UNDP just allowed us to choose the risk-prone communities so we could actually talk to them and administer the surveys with them. So basically for the survey process, we interviewed 3 groups of people. Community leaders, or I would say local government leaders working on different sectors. We also interviewed community representatives, and we interviewed representatives of civil society organizations. Now, the very interesting thing is, I'm talking out of experience with the frontline or with the communities, is when we first started administering the surveys through some of our partner local organizations, we were faced with some questions like, sorry, we don't have disasters in that area, or why are you doing this study? It seems you know that something's coming. So we were faced by communities who had no idea why we were doing this and who really had no perception whatsoever of the risks that would happen in their area, except for, as you can imagine, conflict. So most of their mindset was focused on conflict and wars, because it was the disaster that was recurring in the country. But they were completely disregarding the fact that they could be prone to floods, to earthquakes, to local wildfires, and so on. So when we actually administered the surveys, we realized that communities started thinking a bit more about, oh yeah, our community is prone to fires. Yes, my grandpa told me that we had a really bad earthquake. And then they started thinking in terms of how the climate is affecting their communities and which localized disasters they could actually face, and not just conflict itself. So when we gathered the information in every community, we went back to the community with the same information, and we consulted with them. We presented the results, and we were expecting them to give us our feedback and recommendations. This is what they came up with. Those recommendations are a summary of all the areas that we talked to them. The community recommended conducting risk assessments in consultation with specialists, and when I say specialists, I mean scientists, because they realized that there was a gap between risk information at the higher level and their knowledge of risks. So they wanted to meet with scientists to be able to identify major risks and dangers for every specific area in Lebanon. They also suggested developing community-based early warning systems with a risk communication plan. And they suggested to conduct awareness sessions on disaster risk identification and prevention. And that was really an achievement, because the communities before had not been exposed to any of this information. And then they realized how important that was for them. So basically, what came up of all this study, and what are we currently encouraging? So basically, in each of these areas, we now have community-based disaster risk management committees that have representatives in the national DRR platform. I'd like to say that World Vision, with some other stakeholders, facilitated the formation of a national platform for disaster reduction, which also includes now some ministries. And the great thing about this national platform is that for the first time it includes actual people from the communities. So it's not only high-level people or legislators or decision makers, it's these people, but also people from the front line or from the communities. And second, that's an initiative which has already started. There's a common risk assessment mapping which is taking place for the communities in Lebanon, which is being undertaken by World Vision in partnership with other organizations. And this risk mapping aims at having a common sort of disaster risk management plan for the communities in Lebanon. That's about it. Thank you.